education is the atmosphere, that means that the child learns most from the atmosphere that is around them. So for homeschoolers, this atmosphere includes the home. It especially includes the attitude of the primary homeschool instructor, right? So I know, right? Right. So what that means is that for most of us, it's mom, right? So the atmosphere, it's really our job to set the atmosphere in the home. So if that's, putting nice music on sometimes if the kids are studying or they're just running around, putting up, art. I'll show some examples of some of the art stuff that we do, putting up art around the house, trying to help it keep it clean so that it's aesthetically pleasing, but not crazy clean. I'm just talking about like hygienic. And so that all of that is part of the atmosphere. If the kids look around and they see maps and they see their own artwork and they see other, really great artwork, it sort of gives them a sense of beauty and appreciation. But the biggest thing is it's not just the physical surroundings, but it's the attitude of the mom. Usually if the mom is doing the teaching, it's the attitude of the mom. I can tell, if I go and sit down at the table in the morning, we do morning time every morning, Monday through Thursday at 9:30. And if I sit down there and my attitude is bad, the whole atmosphere is, it's just catching. It's just very, very contagious. But by the same token, if you can sort of gather yourself, right, like before you go out there and start your homeschool day, then it'll pay off because that atmosphere will also sort of set the tone for your homeschool. And then, so atmosphere, education is the atmosphere, education is a discipline. The other tool that we have to teach our kids, the way Charlotte Mason believed it, was the discipline of habits. So that's just encouraging our children and assisting them in developing good habits. The first habit that Charlotte Mason focused on was the habit of attention. Because in reality, unless you have someone's attention, they're not going to learn anything. That attention comes first. So when we first started using the Charlotte Mason method to homeschool, I just said, we're going to spend the whole year focused on attention. And so it goes for any lessons or anything that's going on. As soon as you lose their attention, you've lost them and the learning has stopped. But as soon as that attention is turned on, then there's going to be a whole bunch of learning goes on. Whatever we pay attention to, that's what we learn. So the habits she had, like cleanliness, diligence, what else? Like any type of habit that you want to develop in your kids, what I used to do, I probably should do this more, is to pick one for the year and just work on it. And you can work on it as a family, meaning like I need to work on building my own attention. You know what I mean? Like, and so if the habit is going to be diligence, okay, we're going to work on like doing things well, doing things with excellence, right? And the whole family can take that on. That's another one of the things with which we educate our children. Finally, education is a light. What this means is that the child's mind should be nourished on great life-giving ideas. Ideas are like food for the mind. So just like we wouldn't want to give our kids a complete diet of junk food, that's not to say we don't give our kids junk food at times, because I know I do. But just like we wouldn't want to give them a complete diet of junk food, we don't want to give them a complete diet of like stale, dead ideas, right? And so for Charlotte Mason, this leads into the concept of living books. So for Charlotte Mason, a living book is a book that is usually written by one author, and it's usually written by an author who's in love with that subject. The author wants the reader to know what they know about the subject and what they love about the subject. And so those living books are going to have a narrative. They're going to be usually narrative in nature. They're going to have one author, and they're going to tell a story, and they're going to capture your mind. That's how you feed your mind, with the ideas in living books. So I'm going to give you some examples of living books. So this is a book we're reading right now in our house, my son and I, the 11-year-old. So this book is called The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. And it's about this young man, William Kamkwamba, who is in Malawi, and his family is starving. And he without school. This is why this book is really fun for homeschoolers, because he basically goes to the library and teaches himself engineering and physics. And he creates this. So there's an adult version of this, and there's a young people's version of this. There's also, this young man also has a TED Talk, and then there is an actual movie on Netflix. So the cool thing about this is that it's a living book where you're getting a story, and he wrote this himself. So I read this to my son. We do it as a read aloud, and then I'll tell you how we use sort of the Charlotte Mason method on it. But this is an example of a living book. This is another example of a living book. This book is called Children of the Longhouse. And this book is about a Native American boy. And we're gonna actually be reading this next after we finish The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. And there's a woman out of Richmond who created a really cool unit study for this book that I bought from her for like $7. I think the website is like 5 senses something. But she has a unit study. So we're gonna use that unit study and this book. And so here's the thing. I'm not having to explain to my son how you make a windmill, right? I'm not having to say, okay, this is what this is, and then you add some metal. But it's all in here. He learns it because he's listening to the young man talk about what he did in his process. Now, the young man described what he did. I did not understand it at all. But my son understood it because he's interested in stuff like that. And that's another thing that's cool about the Charlotte Mason method. From that book, I want to know the story. What happened? How did he feel about it? My son is into the science. Like, well, how could he do that? And how did he test that? It doesn't matter. It's all coming from the same book, right? So one of Charlotte Mason's ideas is that you spread the feast in front of your children. So you use art and music and math and science and all these books and poetry and hymns and whatever, and you put all of that in with their studies, a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, so as not to overwhelm yourself or them, and you let the kids pick. Each child is going to get from it something different. So if I'm reading aloud, my daughter may pick up something totally different than what my son picks up. Almost always they will. But it's good because I'm not doing extra work. I'm just reading one book. I'm not reading one book to her, one book to him. They're picking the parts that they like. Okay. Oh, I love this quote. Okay, so here's another, the final Charlotte Mason quote that I'll give. She says, "The question is not how much does the youth know when he has finished his education, but how much does he care? And about how many orders of things does he care? In fact, how large is the room in which he finds his feet set? And therefore, how full is the life that he has before them?" So that's this idea of just giving your children a broad education, because every kid is not going to be into the same thing. There's some kids that are going to be into math, but then there's some kids that are really going to be into art, and there's some kids that are really going to be into science or whatever it is. Putting all that in front of them gives them the opportunity to figure out what it is that they do best. That's that concept of setting their feet in a large room. That's actually from Psalms, when David says to God that he's set his feet in a large room. And so that's one of the things that we're supposed to do for our children. How do we do this practically speaking with Charlotte Mason method? One of the main tenets of the Charlotte Mason education is short lessons. No one believes me when I tell them this, but for most kids, 20 minutes on a lesson is really about as much as it takes. Because honestly, after that, you don't have their attention anymore. And we know that. We can be sitting at a meeting, we could be sitting in church, we can be sitting wherever. If the person is talking for 20 minutes, after that, they've lost us. Unless they break it up, you know what I mean? Like break it up, ask some questions, do something else. They've lost us. It's the same with our kids. And so if your kids are first grade, second grade, third grade, 10 or 15 minutes of whatever subject it is more than enough. If you feel like they didn't finish a lesson, they need to come back to it that day, break it up. 15 minutes here, do some other stuff, 15 minutes there. Now, as your kids get older, you know, when they're in high school and they may be doing some complex math or science or English or something like that. It may stretch to 45 minutes, but even that can be broken up because we all want our kids to learn themselves. So it's important for them to understand when they've lost attention, right? Because we know sometimes we'll be reading something and you're like, I just read 2 pages and I have no idea what it said. Or you'll be driving, you're like, now how did I get that place? Mm-hmm. That's because we've lost attention. So it's good for our kids to figure out when they've lost attention and how they can redirect their attention. And sometimes I'll stop my kids if I'm reading aloud and I see their eyes glaze over. I'll stop and say, okay, redirect, bring it back, bring it back, bring it back. That's what I'll say, like, attention back. And so they can learn to do that for themselves. Okay, we already talked about living books. Charlotte Mason used living books for most subjects instead of textbooks. If you notice, if you open the front of a textbook, it's going to have 4, 5, 6 different authors, right? And living books are books that usually have one author that's really, really passionate about the subject. Textbooks usually have a bunch of different authors. A lot of times the textbooks are politically put together, right? Because this school board and this person, this political group wanted this to go in there. And so I tend to stay away from textbooks. Most of the time, if you're doing math, you can't really stay away from a textbook. So we use a math textbook. We use, especially for the younger grades, we'll use Apologia, like for 5th grade, 6th grade science, because Apologia does try to include a lot of the Charlotte Mason methods in it, and it has one author, the Apologia textbook. So if you're okay with using Christian materials, that's one of the things that that's good. So I'm going to go through the subjects and how they're taught in a Charlotte Mason way. So first, I'll go through language arts. One of the main tools that Charlotte Mason education uses for language arts is called narration. And what narration is, it's Charlotte Mason's answer to reading comprehension, right? So we want to know, okay, are our kids understanding what they're reading? So like in school, they would say, read this story and answer these 5 questions, right? There's actually a better way. And the better way is narration. And what narration is your child reads. So like say your child reads 10 pages out of here or 5 pages, or you read 5 pages to them. Then you say, all right, tell me what happened. Then your child narrates back to you what they heard. And this serves your child better than reading comprehension questions because you're actually making the child go in their mind, ask their minds what happened, right? So they're asking their brain a question and then they're answering it. So they're doing all the work. When you have reading comprehension questions, someone has done a lot of the work because they've concocted the questions themselves. When you're using narration where your child has to tell back to you what they heard, then all of the work and all of the learning is your child's. She recommends don't start narration until, I think it's 2nd grade, 1st or 2nd grade. But what we know is that our children narrate to us all the time. They'll come in from playing outside and say, okay, well, I found this, and then after this, and then we did this, and then we did. It's the same thing. It's the same exact thing. And so you don't have to ever wonder, are they listening? Have they, what have they learned? Have they heard? As the kids get older, the narrations can go from oral narration to being written narration. And so narration is also oral comprehension. I mean, not comprehension, oral composition, because they're having to formulate their own version of the story in their head. And when you write that down, it becomes composition. And as they get older, then they can start writing it in paragraphs and all of that stuff. So that's one of the main tools that I really love about a Charlotte Mason education. Let me see, does somebody have a question? How can we let go of the fear of our child falling behind? Okay, I'm going to answer that question in just a minute. Okay, that's narration. The next thing is dictation. This is Charlotte Mason's answer to sort of like spelling tests. Like we use, from Simply Charlotte Mason, we use a program called Spelling Wisdom, which is dictation, where your child studies like a passage or maybe a sentence or maybe a few words, depending on how young they are. And then you say, okay, now you're going to take that from dictation. So what you would do is you would then read a sentence to your child that they've studied, and they would write it down as you're reading it to them. That's dictation. And you would then, once they've written that, you would go through it and say, okay, are there any misspelled words here? If there are, we formulate a spelling list from those words. And the cool thing about dictation is it's very cost effective, because remember, you could take your living book and you can literally say, we're going to use this living book and we're going to take dictation from that, right? And so then you could say, all right, this first sentence of this paragraph on this page will be the thing you're going to take from dictation. They study it. You say, all right, close your book. Then you read that to them and have them write it. Practicing punctuation, whatever you're working on. If you're working on capitalizing the beginning, capitalizing the beginning of sentences, ending marks, all that stuff, you can do all of that. So that's dictation. As they get older, the dictations get to be longer. The thing that this also helps them do is prepare for if they want to go on to higher studies in college. Dictation is something when you're listening to a professor, right? You got to be writing while you're listening and thinking and writing. A lot of times kids will type their notes now, so it's a little bit different, but you're still writing, you're still thinking, listening, and trying to write at the same time. So that gives you practice for that. Another thing Charlotte Mason Language Arts does is copy work. So copy work is where they usually have, for younger kids, it's 1 or 2 words. For older kids, it starts to be like sentences and paragraphs, where it's a way to practice writing, to practice handwriting. And you can either write it yourself. Like if you really are pressed for money, you take your same living book. This is how you get so much out of it. You take your same living book, you go here, you find a really good passage, like something that's really well spoken and well said. You're like, oh, that's really cool. And then you write it yourself in your best handwriting, and then you leave space, and your child can either write it in print, whatever you're working on, print or cursive. And that helps the child with their handwriting. It also helps the child with attention to detail, because they're having to look up and copy it correctly. Charlotte Mason says you should sort of stand near your child so that if you see them about to make a mistake, you say, wait a minute, go back and look at that. Because she says once they see the word written incorrectly, they'll have that picture in their mind of that word misspelled or something like that. And so then when they're trying to reach for the word later, they'll have that, that erroneous picture in their mind. So that's something to think about. The copy work. We still do copy work in our house with my 6th grader. Literature in Charlotte Mason, it usually goes along with the history that you're studying. So let's say you're studying the history. Let's say you're studying the Civil War, right? With Charlotte Mason, you wouldn't necessarily run out and get a textbook and say, okay, let's find the Civil War. What you would do is you would find some really good living books about the Civil War. Usually they will be biographies. They will be biographies or historical fiction. And so for us in our house, we're always trying to find, for any historical period, especially in U.S. history, what were the Black and brown people doing during that time? And we'll go find books. So if we're talking about colonial times and we're talking about the Revolutionary War, we're going to want to know, okay, so who were the Black people? And I just learned there was I'll have to show you all that book, that there were Latinx people helping fight the Revolutionary War. There are all kinds of people that you don't hear about. So we would go find books about those people. The cool thing is your children are still learning the history of the Revolutionary War, except they're learning it by means of people that look like them. And I tend to think if you open up a book, right? You open up a book and your child sees a brown person the way we didn't see brown people when we were in school, their interest is going to get sparked more. Another last language arts thing for Charlotte Mason is memorization. So I know in classical education, they do memorization too. It's a little bit different. With Charlotte Mason, she doesn't care about memorizing acts or anything like that. Her big thing was memorizing beautiful things said beautifully. So poetry memorization was big in our house. If there's a poem that you think is really awesome, it may be something you get your children to memorize, just little bits. And everybody, including me, would memorize it. If you are a religious person, there may be passages or verses from your book of any spiritual literature from the Bible or whatever. That's another thing that's good for memorization, because what you're trying to do, the way she talks about it, is you're trying to furnish your child's mind with beautiful things so that when they leave your house, they have really good stuff up in their brains, like really good poetry in their brains and really good, spiritual literature or anything like that that's in there. In addition to all the other stuff there, but things that they can call upon when they invariably encounter life, like hard stuff in life, they can call upon some of the things that you learned at home that sort of will build them when they get out there. So that's like the mission of it. Are there any more questions? Okay. History in the Charlotte Mason method is a 4-year cycle, and you do history in chronological order. And of course, instead of using textbooks, right, you use ding, 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 living books. This is why I think the Charlotte Mason method is so awesome, because when you use a textbook, you're automatically agreeing to teach what's in that textbook from the perspective of whoever made that textbook. But when you decide you're going to use living books, you can go to the library and talk to the librarian and say, we are studying whatever period you want to, or whatever country you want to. And you say, we want books about the children from that, from that culture, or the children from that time. So here's an example. So this month, well, September the 14th started Hispanic Heritage Month. And so in our home, we decided we were going to actually celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month by reading about different cultures that make up the Latin American world, right? And so I went to the library and checked out a bunch of books that all have to do from different countries. So the first book we read was about Guatemala. This book, let me see. Okay. This book is called Growing Up with Tamales. And this book, because we haven't read this one yet, I'm thinking this is from Mexico. And then this book is called Bravo. It's Poems About Amazing Hispanics. So these are living books. These books, like this book, will tell you, remember when I was saying about the Revolutionary War? Well, here's the deal. This guy, Juan de Morales, right in here, I believe in the good cause of American independence from England. George Washington is my close friend. Did anybody know that George Washington had a Cuban close friend who helped in the Revolutionary War? No, okay. Like maybe somebody did, I didn't know. But when you venture out beyond what's normally in a textbook, you're gonna find out like the full texture of what was going on at that time, right? So I was so excited to learn this part. And so I was like, okay, this is gonna make me dig more to figure out like, okay, so what was a Cuban dude doing, right? We know there was a French guy helping, we always hear about Lafayette, right? He's French and you hear about him, but you don't hear about this guy. And then you don't hear about, there was a black spy named James Lafayette, right? Who helped win the whole Battle of Yorktown. You don't hear about that, but there's a picture book about that I read to my kids. And so that's why it's cool to bring in the living books, because it adds so much more fullness and we actually get to see ourselves. And a lot of times when we're in textbooks, from people of color in textbooks, we don't actually get to see ourselves, or our children don't get to see themselves represented in the ways that they should be. For science, in the early years, Charlotte Mason method focuses on nature study. And I love that because science is really the study of nature. Like I think people tend to make it real complicated and think like, okay, everything is physics, everything is chemistry, but a lot of it is just the science started from people going outside and looking around and saying like, well, now why does this do this? And why does the sky look like that at this time of year? And so we can do that same thing with our kids through nature study. People talk about how a lot of kids have different trouble paying attention, different all that stuff. Some people think it's because of nature deficit, like that they're not getting out into nature the way they used to. I know as a parent, I don't get out into nature as much as I want to. So nature study for us is my excuse to get all of us out of the house and into nature. And so this is one of the books that actually, I think Charlotte Mason herself might have used. It's called The Handbook of Nature Study. And it's by Anna Botsford Comstock. It's a thick book. It has just about every possible thing you could want to. Look, it even has cockroaches in there. Oh my gosh, it's gross. But, you know, that's under insects. It has all the animals, all the trees, all that stuff. So if you got this book and you said, you know what, it's fall, we're going to focus on oak trees. We're going to figure out all the different kinds of oak trees. We're going to get some acorns. We're going to bring the acorns in and the oak tree leaves and make a little tape, you know, a little area on our table. That's your nature study. And you look in here and you read about the oak tree, you read about the different types of oak trees, and you can compare the acorns. Each oak tree has its different acorn and its different leaf shape. They can trace the leaves. You know how they used to do that in school, where you take a, I think you put a piece of paper and you put a leaf. You can do all that stuff. That's all nature study. It's like endless learning for kids and for adults. I mean, I'm always learning something when I go out there. This is another book that we use. This is called The Nature Connection. And the cool thing about this book is it walks you through 12 months of nature study. So if you're like me and you know you want to create your own nature study, but you know somehow it never gets done quite, you know, but you still want to do it, then you can get this book as your helper. And so for September, the first thing it said is go take a nature walk. So last Friday, my son and I went and took a nature walk, and it said, okay, make a list of all of the things that you see. So like he wrote, he saw mourning dove, which is a type of bird outside. He saw squirrels, and we identified a crepe myrtle tree. So he wrote that on his little list. And the next time we go out, he'll add to some more stuff for September. And then he drew a picture of the month. They give you space. So that's his drawing of a crepe myrtle tree and a squirrel on a fence, which is what we saw. And so for each month, it tells you things to notice, you know, so as it starts to be fall, it tells you things about that. Spring, so every month, so you're not having to make this up out of whole cloth. You actually, you know, have 8. So this is a book that I got on Amazon, and it's great. The other thing I love to combine with nature study and just in general is poetry. Poetry is one of my favorite things. So this is an old book, but I still think it's very good. Favorite poems, old and new. The cool thing about this book is that it's divided up by subject. So like I said, September, right? You start thinking about fall. I can go to this book and look in the table of contents, and it has a whole list of poems about autumn. And so you can say, instead of studying one poet, we're going to study, you know, each day I'm going to read to y'all one poem. And I do that with my kids. We'll usually either pick a poet. So this term, we picked Dr. Maya Angelou. And so I'll read a poem a day. Well, first I'm going to read a little biography about her to them, just a 2 or 3 page biography. And then I'll read a poem a day to them, one of her poems. I don't ask them to say like, what's the rhyme scheme? I don't ask them for like, what was the metaphorical meaning behind it? I just read the poem. We may talk about how beautiful it was. I may say, did you see how she used that word instead of that word? Or I may not say anything. And then the kids may say, oh, that reminds me of such and such. Who knows? I just want them to hear really beautiful language. And so we usually pick like 3 poets for that year, but you could also divide it up in a way that does like the seasons or animals or anything like that. So this is Favorite Poems, Old and New, really great one. The Random House Book of Poetry for Children. This is also divided up that way. Like in the table of contents, if you look, it'll have dogs and cats, bears and bats. That's all about animals. Another subject is children everywhere. And so you see how there are a whole bunch of poems about home. So you see how you can sort of create any topic and just do poems about it. And what I love about that is, I know when I was in school, I thought poetry was like this hard, inaccessible thing. Like, why were people even writing this? This is stupid. And what are we supposed to be getting out of that? You know, because your teacher would ask you to like analyze this poem. Well, when the people were writing poems, they were not sitting going, okay, I want people to analyze it and get this from it. That's not what they were doing. They were writing down what they feel. Poetry is supposed to evoke emotion. It's just like other forms of art, music and painting. It's supposed to evoke emotion. And so I read the poem and let the poem do its work. Just like when we do Bible study in our house, I read the Bible passage and I let the Bible passage do its work. I don't beat it to death and say, you should think about this side or you should think that. I really do trust that what I'm reading is going to actually do the work. That's sort of how I don't know what you want to call it. I make my job easier, but whatever. that's how I do it. Last thing for the Charlotte Mason approach to foreign language is she believes that the student should learn it the same way they learn their native language. That means to start with hearing it and speaking it before worrying about figuring out how to read it and how to use the grammar. So that's if you're going to, if your child's going to study Spanish or your child's going to study French or whatever, try to find a curriculum that focuses on them learning it by hearing it and by speaking it. And then later on, just like we do later on, studying the grammar and the writing of the language. For arts, this is another thing I just love about Charlotte Mason method. So I'm not an artist at all. Like I'm not good at art at all. But for Charlotte Mason, the cool thing is you don't have to be. One of the things that she does for art is called artist study. Like you might call it art history or whatever. So what we do in our house is we pick 3 artists for the year. And these talking about visual artists now. We pick 3 for the year. And then I'll read a little bit about their history to the child, like to the kids. And then we'll study a different like artwork of theirs each week. So Simply Charlotte Mason has these art portfolios. And so the way you do it in Charlotte Mason, the portfolios come with a little biography book about, so this is a Van Gogh one. I would read a little about Van Gogh so the kids can know, okay, that's who he is. And then I would say, okay, this is our painting for the week. This is the Van Gogh painting for the week. And I would hold it up for about 3 minutes and the kids would study it. And then I would put it down and I would say, give me your narration. And the kids would go back and forth taking turns. Well, I saw a bed. Well, then I saw that it was a red comforter on the bed. And I saw, and then they go back and forth until they sort of exhausted what they saw. But what you're trying to do is get them to pay attention to detail and to appreciate the art that's gone into it. For my kids, we would usually do a notebooking page for each artist. So we would write down, when they were born and that type of thing. And then sometimes I would ask them to sketch. Okay, now from what you remember, sketch, try to sketch a duplicate of what you saw. That type of thing. And then I would place this painting, this print, somewhere prominently in our house. So for me, that would be on our kitchen table. I would put it, I had a little stand and I would put it on the stand so that when they're sitting there eating breakfast, they can be looking at this, right? I mean, for us, we used to like read the cereal box. This is something that they could do. And so I would do like 8 or 9 of these, so 1 each week. Unfortunately, Simply Charlotte Mason doesn't have any Black artists, so then you're out going to look on your own because the method still works. It's just a matter of what you use it on. So I found this Henry Ossawa Tanner. He was a famous Black artist. And this is one of his most famous paintings. It's called The Banjo Lesson. I know when I grew up, we had this print in our house and I didn't know who painted it. But then when I started studying with my kids, I was like, oh, Henry Ossawa Tanner. And so this is a coffee table book, which you can check out from the library. There's no need to buy these because they're expensive. But I found this on Amazon for cheap. You can check out from the library this book, and then you can pick a painting. Like, let's just say you want to pick the banjo lesson for that week. You would turn to this page and you would have the kids study it and look at it. And then you would talk about it. The cool thing that if you pick Henry Ossawa Tanner to study for your artist, then when you're finished, you can actually go to the Hampton University Museum and his original paintings are there. Like you can literally go there and see this painting. It's amazing. because I think it's really cool for the kids to study it. Like I actually figured out what paintings were there, and I picked those paintings to study from the book so that they had seen it in the book, and then they could go see the real thing. And they're always amazed at how big the actual painting is. So that's sort of artist study, art history, that type of thing for Charlotte Mason. The last thing is music study, how she did music. She did several things. One, she called it hymn study, like HYMN, because she was a Christian. So for us, we do study hymns because I grew up in the AME church, and that's all we sang was hymns. And when I was a little kid, I hated hymns. I thought they were crazy and old and boring, and we should be singing what is on the radio on the gospel station. But nonetheless, we studied hymns. It's only as I got older and I was an adult and I encountered life, and I was like, oh, that's what they were that's what that hymn was referring to? And so it was one of those things I was like, as an older person, I appreciated the hymns, but as a young person, I was like, this stuff sounds old. Why are we singing it? So fast forward to my own kids, they don't sing hymns in our church. Like they don't sing. I mean, sometimes they'll like do a throwback, and sing like one on Communion Sunday or whatever, but they don't sing hymns in our church. So I said, we're going to do hymn study. So the way we do hymns in our home is I pick like 3 or 4 for the year. And then we'll study, each one. We'll take our time. They don't have to memorize it because we use a hymn book. And that was one of the things they were going to learn, how to use a hymn book. Because if they go to church with their grandma, she used a hymn book, and y'all need to know how to read it. And then we would just sing hymns. And the cool thing is you don't even have to have a hymn book because you can go on YouTube and you can put in, for example, this week, the hymn was It Is Well With My Soul, right? Like old school. And you can put in It Is Well With My Soul karaoke. You will find the words and the melody all right there. And you can just hold up your phone because this is what I've done. Hold up my phone and we sing the hymn that way. That's one way to do music study. The other thing she has is composer study, where you pick like 3 composers for the year. For us, we alternate. One year we do music, one year we do artists, like that, because I don't want to overwhelm myself. So we would pick a composer and we would study a little bit about their life. This is a really cool book for kids. It's called The Lives of the Musicians, Good Times, Bad Times, and What the Neighbors Thought. So this has, a little mini biography of Beethoven, a mini biography of Scott Joplin, who was one of the few Black, brown people in the book. It has, Brahms and all those people. And so what we would do is I would read a little bit of that biography, and then I would play like one of their more famous compositions, because I want them to sort of be able to recognize, oh, okay, that's Beethoven, or that's Brahms, or whoever, or that's Ragtime, that's Scott Joplin. And then usually what I would do is for that week, that would be the song that I would play around the house. So they're listening, they're picking it up. It's in the atmosphere. I'm not having to teach them like, you should listen to this music. It's just in the atmosphere, and they just pick it up. That's sort of how I do it. I broadened, so I've now learned about several like Black classical composers that of course were hidden from us, right? I took a class this summer on OutSchool, or no, it wasn't on OutSchool. I think I found it through Facebook, where this Black woman who's a violinist with the Illinois Symphony Orchestra taught a class on Black classical composers. And so now I know the names of a lot more. So if anybody wants to know the names of some Black composers and they want to, use that, let me know. And I'll just play a song by, that composer for that week, and then we switch to the next one the next week. And I also broadened it, because composer to me is not just a composer of classical music, it's someone who writes music. So for you and your family, you may decide, so for one of ours, we did Bob Marley. Because I was like, he to me is an amazing songwriter. So, and I feel like you shouldn't leave our house not knowing who Bob Marley is. How you gonna be out a grown person, right? And like No Woman, No Cry comes on and you're like, what is that song? Like, that's not cool. So I was like, so that's one composer we studied one year. You know, we read a little biography about him, and then each week it would be a different song. And so I tend to try to pick the most famous ones so that when they're out, when they're out and about, if they hear something, they're like, oh, okay. But a lot of times, if you've heard enough things from one artist, you immediately know who that artist is, even if it's a different song, because you sort of can recognize their works. And so that's how you do art, history, music, all that stuff in a Charlotte Mason manner. So that is my talk. Okay, hold on, let me see. Okay, how can we let go of the fear of our children falling behind? So whenever somebody asks me this question, what I say, the first thing I say, and whenever I think this to myself, because I do think to myself, oh my goodness, is my child falling behind? The first question you have to ask is behind whom, right? Because if we're homeschooling, then there is no person who is behind our child and no person who our child can be behind, right? So for me in homeschooling, there's no ahead, right? You can't say, oh, my child is working ahead. Working ahead of whom? Who else is in your homeschool that they're working ahead of or being compared to? There really isn't, right? That's a schoolish idea that forces people to feel less than or better than. I'm ahead, I'm behind. There's no such thing. Your child is where your child is based on their learning. If they get to some material that's hard and they need to take it slow, that's what you homeschool for. So you take it as slowly as possible. If they're breezing through and they want to just move on, then you move on with them. That's the freedom that homeschool gives you. You never have to be behind. I tell new homeschoolers this all the time. You never have to be behind again. You never have to say my child is behind ever, ever, ever again, because your child is where they are. All right, what if my child goes back to school? They're going to say my child is behind. Well, what I tell people this year, this is the year where you don't have to worry about that. Because I can guarantee you, if you're homeschooling your child this year and you put them back in school next year, they will probably be whatever is known as ahead, because they're actually doing work that's not sort of being funneled through the public school system, funneled through the virtual learning, right? There's real learning going on in your home. So I think every time I have that question in my head, I just say behind whom, behind whom. And when I can't answer that question because there is nobody for my child to be behind, it sort of makes me feel a little bit better. Thanks for that question, because it comes up, everybody has that concern. Which title were you talking about, Shannon? I'm sorry.
You put it up. It was The Nature Connection. I got it the second time you showed it.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Charlotte Mason give you a list of living books. Charlotte Mason, if you go to AmblesideOnline.com, that is it's people who have done a lot of work. It's a free resource. It's people who have done a lot of work to lay out the living books that are good for each sort of historical period that you would study. And it gives you lists of living books for all types of levels of kids, 5th grade, literature, and all that stuff. The problem with Ambleside Online is that it is almost entirely Eurocentric. Almost entirely. You're not going to find any books, living books on there with brown people in it. So that's my only caution. That's not to say some of those books aren't good, but if you're trying to bring in diversity to your curriculum, you're going to have a hard time finding it there. So what I usually do instead is I will Google like books for 5th graders, about Black people or brown people in this time period, something like that. You can even put that in Amazon. Amazon will usually come up with, especially if okay, I know about Crispus Attucks, right? Okay, Crispus Attucks was like the first person to die in the Revolutionary War, like they call that the first person to die in the Revolutionary War. He was a Black man. So you put in Amazon a book on Crispus Attucks, right? The Attucks Theater, that's what that's named after in Norfolk. You put a book, you put that in there, it's going to then pull up some other books, probably about Black people during that time period. And so that's how you can develop a list. The other thing people can do is message me, because I love to try to find books and scour and try to find books that have, different diverse characters and stuff. And can you apply the Charlotte Mason method on any book? Yeah, I think that's why you use the living books, because that narration method works very well with any living book. It doesn't really work with the textbook, because textbooks tend to just spout facts, and so there's nothing really to narrate. There's nothing for the mind to chew on. That's what I mean by like living ideas and nourishing ideas. There isn't anything for the mind to chew on. But if you read, okay, so the read aloud that we have for my kids right now, it's called a book called Never Caught. And it is the story of George Washington's runaway enslaved person. Her name was Ona Judge. So was she 17? I'm forgetting. But she ran away from George and Martha Washington, and she ran from Philadelphia to New Hampshire, and she was never caught. George Washington tracked her he had her tracked until the time he died, and she was never caught. She lived in New Hampshire. She had a whole family and all of that stuff, and she was never caught. So, like, to me, I'm thinking, well, why don't I know who she is? Why would I not know who Ona Judge is? It's an amazing story. The book, I read the adult version of the book this summer. There's a young person's version of it, and so many books are now starting to be written with a young person's version of the book, which is awesome. So I'm reading this book to my kids, and everybody's like, no way. Like, they're trying to figure out, like, one, how did she do it? Two, it's amazing that she did it. And three, how come folks don't know about that? So when you're studying George Washington, why not study her, right? We all know who George Washington is, but this person, we don't. And to me, it's so much more inspirational for our kids. Any other questions? Who said Tupac? You're talking about for composers? Yeah, absolutely. That's right. Anybody who wrote their own, I mean, if you think about some of the stuff that Tupac wrote, right? I think he actually has a book of poetry or something like that. That's the type of thing that you can explore with your kids. Like, how is this poetic? How is this, what do you like about this? Who was this person? All of those things, because all the people's lives are so interesting, and everybody's biography. The cool thing about reading biographies to your kids is that not only do you get to learn about the person, but it also tells you the historical context of the person. So you don't have to read a history textbook to learn about what was going on, let's just say, in the United States in the 1990s. You can read Tupac's biography and you can find out, okay, in this segment of the United States, this is what's going on. This is the politics of the time, or that type of thing. Oh, okay. So Dr. Maya Angelou, now I need to bring that in since we're studying Dr. Maya Angelou now. It inspired him to write the way he did. Perfect. So that's the type of thing. And I think it's cool to spread that feast in front of our kids to let them know, like, there isn't one type of like perfect music. Like, classical music is cool, but if that's not what you're into, you might be into, you might be into Tupac, you might be into whoever. It's important for them to know, okay, I can like poetry, and it doesn't have to look like this one thing that we were taught poetry was. It can look like hip hop, or it can look like it's something lyrical.
Adrienne, I have a question about that.
Yes.
Do you recommend we study composers who have passed, or does it matter?
For me, it doesn't matter. I think, especially if you can find one who's still composing, I think that's really cool to be able to study that person, because a lot of times if they're still composing, you can usually find like YouTube videos of that person and stuff like that. Or if you're lucky, like go hear, some of their compositions being played or something like that. So you can do current people, you can do older people. The cool thing I like to show my kids is that music, especially in art, it repeats itself. So like my kids will be singing a song and then I'll start singing. They're like, well, how do you know that song? I'm like, oh, because such and such did that back in the 80s. And I remember my mother saying to me, that's James Brown. Like, that's what she, about some hip hop song. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's, she's like, that's James Brown. So it's like, it's cool for them to learn that, there's really nothing new under the sun. People are using the same like rhythm and all of that stuff. And it just changes over, over time as to how it's presented. Anything else?
Yeah, I had another question.
Sure.
I'll just continue asking mine, and anyone can just jump in if you think of, because I was taking my notes down. So my other question was, I was just curious what happened at your 9:30 a.m. family time in the mornings?
So we have 9:30 is called morning time. If you have younger kids, you might call it circle time, but it's that time of gathering the family together to do some stuff together. And I pack the things that are most important during this time into it. So we usually start out saying, we do a lot of Hebrew and Jewish stuff in our home. So we start out saying the Shema, which is like a Jewish prayer. And then I'll read a passage from the Bible. We'll usually study one book at a time. So right now we're in Proverbs. I'll read one of the Proverbs to them. And we may or may not discuss it. Sometimes I'll be reading, it'll say something that I really want them to get, like, he who does not work should not eat. I'd be looking like, like stuff like that. And then we'll usually sing a hymn, whatever hymn we're working on that time, we'll do that. And then we'll usually say the Lord's Prayer. And then I will read a poem from whatever poet we're studying or whatever, aspect of poetry we're studying. I'll read that poem. And then if we're doing, then I'll do our read aloud book. So right now that book is called Never Caught. That was about George Washington's escaped slave. I'll read a little bit from that. And when I say I read a little bit, I'm really reading like 3 or 4 pages. And so I'll read. I do not ask for a narration of that, but I will read that to them. And that's sort of our book. We'll have a read aloud going. Once we finish that book, we'll start the next read aloud. The last 2 things. So for right now, for Hispanic Heritage Month, I'm reading those picture books, and don't sleep on picture books. You can do picture. I have a 16-year-old and I have an 11-year-old. We're doing picture books because picture books, the vocabulary in picture books is really advanced because I guess they are thinking that the parents reading it. The pictures are awesome. And they really give you sort of like the basic level of what you need for knowledge, especially if you don't know something about a historical period. So right now we're doing that. What I found this year is this thing called the Social Justice Planner. I had not seen it before, but it's a social justice planner and it's a calendar. If you Google Social Justice Planner, you should find it. It's $10 PDF. I downloaded it and it has all of the different anniversaries of different things. So that's how I knew it was Hispanic Heritage Month, because it said September 14th. And then September 15th was like Mexican Independence Day. And then in the back of that planner, it gives you a little breakdown. Mexican Independence Day was this date and blah, blah, blah. And so it already has your jumping off point for your discussions with your kids. So and you can write down, that's where I write down my morning time plans. The last thing we do at morning time, we haven't done this year, I know my kids are probably happy about that, but whatever, is what's called Awkward Friday discussions, where I would bring up some topic that's terribly awkward, whatever that may be, sex, drugs, mental illness, whatever it is that you do not want to hear your mom discussing with you, I will bring it up. Because I'm like, well, I don't want somebody else bringing it up with you. Like, that's part of my job. So let's just make it as awkward as we possibly can and discuss it here. And I'll circle back. I have like probably 10 or 15 of those little 5-minute talks that I give. I say, y'all can roll your eyes as much as you want to, and they do, but they're listening, but they're rolling their eyes, but they're listening, they're acting like they're not listening. Because I'm just like, these are things I want you to leave here knowing, or if you don't know it, I have in my book that we talked about consent on this date. If you go out there and act a fool, that's on you because we talked about it and I told you what it was, right? So that's one of the things that we do. I used to try to do it like once a week. And I have like a list. If anybody wants, it's like a list of like 15 awkward Friday talks that you don't even want your kids to just, and it's just age appropriate, you know what I mean? So, but that's the last thing I do with the morning time. I try to fit that into 30 minutes.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
So obviously, you know, our homeschools have seasons, you know, depending on, you know, the ages of the kids and so forth. I have 2-year-old twins, and I have 3 school agers, ages 12, 10, and 8. And I know I'm not the only one in the group with a big family, but I think we started out with a Charlotte Mason perspective in our homeschool 7 years ago, and then gradually, you know, as life has shifted and changed, I find myself leaning more classical, in part because I struggle to trust the process. So you describe your 30-minute morning time, and I'm over here like, if I could get 30 uninterrupted minutes, you know,
yeah,
a whole nother thing. And so, you know, and so my older kids quite often will just kick me out of the room. You know, like, you and them babies go over there,
right,
get some work done, because they kind of, you know, they know the routine by now.
Yeah.
But what I'm finding is happening is that we're not getting that gathering time like we used to, because it feels so chaotic, you know, for my little kids. And so they'll get up and start their schoolwork at 7 o'clock in the morning so they could do it with some peace and quiet. And so, just creating that atmosphere. Or maybe can you speak to, you know, when your son that you're homeschooling now, when he was younger, and, you know, and you had your older kids and you were schooling them, you know, how do you set realistic expectations for what that looks like, and that it's okay if it doesn't look like a clean 30-minute conversation?
For that season, you for one thing, morning time doesn't have to be in the morning. So like if your twins take a nap, then you could gather the older ones during that time. But I just love even having the little teeny ones at that time, you know, and so if you can tolerate a little wildness during that time, usually they're going to like the singing part. If you put any singing in there, most kids will immediately sort of like quiet down and like, what are they doing? And just hold it to 10 minutes. And so if you've got 10 minutes of time where they can last 10 minutes and not be berserk, figure out what are the most important 10 minutes, right? So for me, what I would do is I would do Bible, hymn, and poem. And that'd be 10 minutes and we're done. And see there, you've gotten your language arts, right? Because you got your poetry, so they're hearing the language. Your older kids are hearing the language. Your younger kids are hearing the language. You got the music. So to me, that sort of brings in the artistry part, but it also, for me, even though we always joke about how terrible we sound, and I'm like, well, it says make a joyful noise, so we're good. But they talk about how terrible we sound. But I always feel like, for me, it's so sublime. Like, I try to remember those things in my head, like my children singing those hymns when they're 10. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's the type of thing that makes me want to cry, because I'm thinking, when they're 20, you know, they're not like, they won't remember that. But me, I will still have that picture in my head of those voices singing. That takes about 10 minutes. And then as their kids get older and older, because remember, you have a ton of time, even though you don't think you do, you can add on a little and a little and a little. You know what I mean? I hope that helps. Okay. Any other questions? I have like maybe, what time is it? Before I got to start my ballet, I have like 5 more minutes.
Let me check Facebook. There are no questions in Facebook land.
Oh yeah, Lamanda, you should go back to just introducing some part of your Charlotte Mason in there. I just think it feels like with Charlotte Mason, it feels like, because it doesn't feel as academically rigorous, but I guarantee you it is. I just think it's slower, you know what I mean? And it's more intentional. But it definitely is academically rigorous, because it's forcing your kids to think more for themselves, like to use their brains and not use your brain, to use their brains, not use yours.
Awesome.
I was going to ask you one more thing, and now I forgot what it was. So I'm going to go on. I'll remember in the next 30 seconds.
I tagged Adrienne in one of our posts on a group page. So if your question comes back, this is for anyone and myself, because I'm going to follow up. I have a question for you later. You said we can message you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
My final question, and maybe Heather, yours will come back. How do you keep your kids curious? I know your kids are getting older, mine are getting older. And sometimes I do things and I feel like they might not be interested because they're getting older, but I want them to stay curious. So how do I just continue that process?
That's a really good question. I just I think in the unschooling world, they have this thing called strewing. I just find little stuff and put it in their path. And then I have to have complete detachment from the outcome, right? So there's stuff, okay, for example, when I was growing up, I loved Judy Blume books. Like, how many of us love Judy Blume books? I got these Judy Blume books and was like, I took it to my daughter like, this is Judy Blume. And she was like, I don't even like that. I don't like that, right? And so there's a part of you that's like, what do you mean? What do you, like, who doesn't like? She didn't. And so I had to be like, okay. She found her own, young girl books that she liked. Same with any type of music. Same with, this is a recent thing. So the Hamilton, Hamilton is on Disney Plus, right? So I said, I'm just going to start playing the Hamilton soundtrack during dinner time on Friday nights. That's our big dinner time, Friday night. And so I just started playing it. Now, my youngest son, the 11-year-old, he plays it on his own and he's memorizing the words. And I'm acting like I don't care. Like, I'm acting like, right? I'm like, okay, like, oh, okay, that's cool. But I'm thinking about that. Oh my gosh, that's awesome. But I'm acting cool, right? I'm acting cool about it because I have to be detached. Because he may decide tomorrow he doesn't care anymore about that. And usually that's what happens with our kids. They pick up something and put it down. They pick up something and put it down. To me, the minute we show an over interest in it, they're like, like, ooh, I don't know.
You said a whole word with that.
Yeah. So you sort of have to be
Taking
detached
notes
from it,
Yes.
And so you just put things in their path. They may pick it up. They may not. But you're detached from it because you're like, that's just something I'm putting before you. Spread the feast. I'm putting that feast in front of you. Grab from it what you will. And the hardest part for us is managing our own expectations. You know what I mean? Like managing, that's the big thing for me. So I just fake it. A lot of times I just fake it big time.
Okay, I finally remembered.
Yes.
So first, I love what you said about detachment from the outcome. I think that's so important, and no matter how long I've been doing this or whatever, I always forget, and I get back down in the weeds, and somebody's got to pull me back out. Yes. And the other thing is, my kids love Hamilton too, so our boys need to touch base. But but don't let them know we know. So and the question was, the things that you're saying in the about putting together a Charlotte Mason approach and pulling in literature and all of that, it all makes sense. And having some experience with the method, I think that makes it easier. But for somebody who might be working full time or have a large family or be new to homeschooling or other reasons why that it might feel like a little overwhelming, how do I create this on my own? I don't have any experience with that. What are some resources that might be a good starting point to learn more about the Charlotte Mason method or more about how to make it seem more attainable?
Yeah, that's good. So there are several websites. So I like simply charlottemason.com because she sort of breaks it down. She has a blog and she has materials, but she breaks it down for little, young kids and on up. The biggest thing for me, if I were to tell somebody, like if I had to boil down Charlotte Mason, you have to take everything away, what would you keep? For me, it would be poetry study, living books, which I would get from the library and read to all the kids who are sitting around me. And everybody could be playing, as long as they're quiet, they could be playing with, with any types of toys or whatever, but they're listening. It would be poetry, the reading aloud, and the nature study. Those are the things that I think really set it apart and will keep your kids' interest. And so if you think those three things, then you can literally use your library and use your outdoors to start to make your curriculum up. and just do. And the cool thing is with those things, you can ask your kids, hey, y'all, you know, what do y'all want to learn about in nature? And I guarantee you they'll have an opinion about it. And you can use that as your jumping off point, right? And so you say with one of your kids, all right, 12-year-old, you get to pick this time. You know what I mean? And then your next youngest one, you get to pick next time what type of, you know, what we're going to study out of nature, or what type of books we want to, you know, what type of historical period we want to study. But if you just bring in those, and then if you use the methods of narration, copy work, and dictation, those will do a whole bunch of the work for you. And you don't have to have a lot of resources for it. But you can use those, and just little teeny short lessons, short lessons. If you stick to short lessons, your kids will love you. Your kids will love you, and you will love yourself because you will get in fewer fights. That's the other short lessons. Yes. All right, you guys. Well, this has been so awesome. I hope it's helpful for folks.
Very helpful.
Feel free to post in the group and tag me, and I'll answer any questions, or just send me a private message and I'll answer. Okay.
Adrienne, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and all of your wisdom and knowledge. Thank you so much again.
This was fun. Just like anything else, anytime you have to teach something, you're like, oh, I suppose I should start doing that. Okay. Oh.
Yeah, but it's like it's just coming out of you, just
that's funny.
Very easily. So we appreciate that.
Thanks. Well, y'all take care.
You too. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See y'all.
Bye.